Good morning, members of the Committee for Constitutional Affairs and Decolonization, support staff, radio listeners, TV viewers, those following via social media, and members of the media. Welcome to this committee meeting, number 4 of today, Tuesday, April 19th, 2022, and the first ever panel roundtable discussion on the Charter of the Kingdom of the Netherlands, organized by this Committee for Constitutional Affairs and Decolonization, Parliament of Sint Maarten. I am honored to welcome our esteemed panelists, Dr. Nilda Arduin, Mr. Reinald Groeneveld, Professor Gerard Hogers, and Mr. Julio Romney. We have established a quorum of 6 members. Please stand for a moment of silence. I have received a notice of absence from the following committee members: MP William Marlin. I have received notice of lateness from MPs Romu and Bijlani. Are there any notifications from the floor? I see no need. The agenda point for this committee meeting is the expert roundtable panel discussion on the Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Ladies and gentlemen, over 68 years ago, the Charter of the Kingdom of the Netherlands came into existence. Today, it remains the foundational constitutional framework and regulation for the countries, the Netherlands, Aruba, Curaçao, and Sint Maarten. It is important to remember that the Charter has been modified and altered over its existence, with the last significant changes taking place in 2010, when the Netherlands Antilles was dissolved or ceased to exist, and the new countries, Curaçao and Sint Maarten, came into existence, while Bonaire, Sint Eustatius, and Saba became special municipalities of the Netherlands, respectively. So today, a few questions to ponder while we listen to our expert panelists. It has been 12 years since the establishment of this new kingdom constellation. Do we believe that we are experiencing a paradigm shift in the relations between the governments of the Netherlands and those of the islands of the Dutch Caribbean, or is history repeating itself? And if yes, what should we do? Do we believe that there is a need to amend the Kingdom Charter to address the democratic deficits that exist now, or any new deficits that will be created due to current political events? Is there a need to constitutionally redefine what it means to be a citizen in the kingdom? The main objective of this expert panel discussion is to allow the members of parliament and the general public to receive information and advice on the Charter of the Kingdom in order to design an approach to amending it. This objective has multi-partisan support and agreement, and this is something that I believe is important to note, that every or almost every party in this parliament has agreed to this objective. A year ago, members of a subcommittee of this committee, namely MPs Pantoflet, Peterson, and suspended member Bonkamper, proposed a list of local and kingdom constitutional experts, and these experts were invited to present position papers on the Charter as it related to the United Nations in terms of decolonization, the history of the Charter, and also the democratic deficits that exist in the Charter. I would like to thank the members of that subcommittee, the members of this committee for their input and support of the proposal, and also, of course, the experts who accepted our invitation and prepared their position papers and are here today. We move on to today's meeting format. Our experts will have 10 minutes to present their papers, their positions. These position papers are also available for download on the website of Parliament. After each expert has presented, the floor will be open to the members of Parliament for questions, comments, discussion, and debate. We will break for lunch at 12:30 and then return at 1:30, where discussions will continue, but where also our experts will be asked questions from the general public. This committee finds public engagement, especially on this topic, extremely important. And so the public is hereby informed that on our Facebook page, there will be a link that they can click on in which questions can be submitted to our panelists. Our panelists will present in alphabetical order, and without further ado, we will begin. Our first presenter is an educator, a lawyer, and from 2010 to 2017 was the first ombudsman of St. Martin, Dr. Rashnilda Ardern. Dr. Ardern, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. It's for me a pleasure. Good morning to everybody, my fellow panelists, members of Parliament. My position on the topics presented by the Chair is as follows. I believe that whatever terms apply to establish formal decolonization of the Netherlands Antilles, St. Martin is far from being de facto decolonized. This also applies, of course, to the other Dutch Caribbean partners of the kingdom. Creating a new instrument to organize contemporary kingdom relations as part of the decolonization process should not be dismissed. My approach to this topic and my paper is my approach to the whole decolonization process is from the viewpoint of transform and inform. Because I believe that collective consciousness of the state of St. Martin anno 2022 is pivotal to successfully initiate an approach to amending the Charter. I advocate and draw attention to the need for clarity and inclusiveness initiated by St. Martin in the process of de facto decolonization in order to move forward sustainably. When we look at the creation of the Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Charter anno 2022, I refer to Article 5 of the Charter, which provides that the organs of the kingdom referred to in the Charter and the exercise of royal and legislative power in kingdom affairs shall be governed, if not provided for by the Charter, by the Constitution of the kingdom. And that means the kingdom here used in the sense of the Netherlands. In this regard, I truly appreciate the outline provided by Professor Hogers in his opinion paper regarding the Constitution of the Netherlands versus the Charter. Note that according to the first Constitution for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, dating back to 1814, when the Netherlands regained its independence and became a monarchy, the Dutch kingdom encompassed the Netherlands and a few colonies and assets of the state. One thing I want to draw attention to when we talk here about colonies and the assets, in the Dutch version it is volksplantingen en bezittingen van het Rijk. The colonies, volksplantingen, what are volksplantingen? The persons coming from one part to another part, yes? That means the colonist. At the time of that first constitution, slavery was still in force. Enslaved Africans were also assets. It was not until 1922 that the Constitution included not only the European territory, but also Indonesia, Suriname, and Curaçao and its dependencies. Holland, the motherland, had an obligation towards her people. And her people, when we talk, as I explained just now, we have to realize that her people are the colonists, stations in the overseas territories. I'd like to implore that as we discuss the way forward today, to recognize the importance and the need to place the procedures and documents that we will be discussing in the social political environment of the pertinent time. Laws organize relationships between people and are not mere academic exercises about systems and forms. The pertinent institutions in the Caribbean territories at the time obtained limited powers to regulate their internal affairs. Bear in mind that the authority of the governor representing the motherland, assisted by the executive and colonial councils represented by high-ranking Dutch civil servants and the elites, were the norm. I also like to draw attention because it's something that many of my generation have been very confused about, and I still hear that discussion today. Mind you that the motherland as being the place of origin of the colonists, to be distinguished from the term imperial home country, the empire state. I furthermore observed the relevance of the environment of global decolonization, which lies at the cradle of the Charter, to understand St. Martin's position within the Dutch kingdom today and moving forward. Though the European powers, including the Netherlands, were initially determined to preserve colonial rule after World War II, they lacked the wealth and political support necessary to suppress faraway revolts. The Cold War led the US to focus on strengthening their European allies against the perils of Soviet invasion and domestic communism. Indonesian nationalists' role in crushing communist activities encouraged the United States' efforts to pressure the Dutch to leave that territory. This period of decolonization fundamentally reshaped the world. The developments as a result of the historic speech in 1942 of Queen Wilhelmina in exile in London, announcing a kingdom by which the Netherlands was seeking to further strengthen ties with their largest colony, Indonesia, are not to be dismissed. However, the Netherlands could no longer play its role after the war. In 1947, we all know that the Republic Indonesia declared itself independent from the Netherlands after the Japanese occupation of 1942 to 1945. Left with the Caribbean colonies to deal with, 1948, the state regulation was enacted. And I care to point out that the state regulation introduced general suffrage to include the descendants of the former enslaved Africans, and as such, I observe that this group of the population was not duly and directly represented during the deliberations leading up to the enactment of the Charter, because the Charter was enacted in 1954. So if only in 1948 they got voting rights, we can understand that representatives of that group was not directly at the table. 1950 birthed the Interim Regulation Netherlands Antilles, a prelude to the Charter, including the right of self-determination for the islands, further outlined in the Island Regulation, which is known as the ERNA. 1954, enactment of the Charter. The Kingdom of the Netherlands fostered a system of free association with its former colonies through the Charter, marked by a democratic deficit in decision-making within the realm, or, and I look at my panel colleague at the right side, a lack of democratic legitimacy. Interesting an approach argued by my fellow panelist, Mr. Romney. Be reminded that thus far, the colonial administration was in the interest and in the hands of the descendants of the colonists and newcomers from the Netherlands and others, such as Jews, Portuguese, Lebanese, Venezuelans, as a result of the oil refinery in Curacao. Even so, I observed that there was no formal preparation to assume government responsibilities, no institutions of higher education. Whether the new order represented a unitary or federal state or a state juris sui generis, eloquently outlined by panelist Mr. Groen, was not relevant at the time. Patronage was the system of the day and continued thereafter. Subsequent administration governed by way of do what you have seen. One of the effects of decolonization is the instability of the post-colonial political systems with far-reaching consequences such as deep economic problems, inhibiting growth, and widening disparities between the northern and the southern part of the globe. Conditional aid arrangements, Dutch paternalistic role, and poor accountability structures increase power imbalances within the kingdom. Dismantling the Netherlands Antilles in 2010, as the chair said, has been one of the most radical changes of the charter for the island since its enactment in 1954. Until 2010, St. Martin had no direct representation and deliberations with the imperial home country regarding the transatlantic relationship, other than utilizing its right of self-determination to acquire an anonymous status within the Kingdom of the Netherlands. The adage, standing on our own with the will to support each other, became a reality for St. Martin. St. Martin became responsible and accountable for making decisions as well as executing and living up to them. The period 2010 to 2022 is marked by internal challenges compounded by negotiations in the aftermath of unfortunate external events like the hurricanes of 2017 and the global pandemic, which negatively impacted the relationship between St. Martin and the Netherlands. In closing, Madam Chair, I remark that inasmuch as it is questionable whether removal of the Netherlands Antilles from the United States list of non-self-government territories is justified, the power imbalance within the kingdom is undeniable when it comes to decision-making about the autonomous country within the realm. The method to deal with this cannot be just proportionate, because territory, population, human capacity, etc. will not allow that, but needs to be comprehensively addressed. A reality check of the social political evolution within the territory since the enactment of the Charter is required to renegotiate and adjust the current kingdom relations and collaboration in order not to impede future generations. Creating a new instrument to organize contemporary kingdom relations as part of the decolonization process should be an option. I thank you. I look forward to have a nice discussion with the panel and the members of Parliament.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ardern. I want to remind the public that yours and every panelist's the position paper is available for download on the website of the Parliament. And it is important because it is so rich with not only with information, but with your recommendations. As you stated, it is your opinion that we are not technically de facto decolonized, and because of the reasons that you mentioned. And history is showing us that not only do we have so much to learn from it, but that we can use it then to design new instruments for a new approach to contemporary relations, which I think is important, especially now. So thank you so much, Dr. Ardern. I now move on to our next presenter, who is an educator and an attorney at law, and up until present was the first acting governor of St. Martin. Since 2010, the first acting governor of St. Martin, Mr. Reinoud Groeneveld. Mr. Groeneveld, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. President of Parliament, members of Parliament, members of the committee, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good morning. First of all, let me thank our Parliament and the members of the organizing committee for inviting me to take part in this very important panel discussion. It is a privilege to participate together with the other panelists in this collaborative effort to further educate and inform our people. Please note, and I would like to emphasize, that the views and my presentation here is based on my academic knowledge. I have been studying our Constitution long before I became a lawyer. And I would beg that anything that I say here or present here is not associated with my other function that the chair just mentioned and should not be attributed as such. In that line, there might be one or two questions that might be a bit direct that I might have to decline, but we will see when we reach that bridge. I would also like to thank the fellow panelists for accepting to participate in this event, and I know that we will have a very positive and enlightening discussion on the Kingdom Charter, and we will be able to offer our leaders useful information and advice that will be beneficial to them in their future decision making. I will not repeat the entire content of my position paper here in this introduction, but I will attempt to further elucidate on some main points, and for the rest, refer to the paper for the other topics. One of the points that I think is very important is the constitutional structure of our kingdom. In my paper, I presented the view that the structure of our kingdom as laid down in the Charter is that of a federal state and not a unitary state as it now functions. I am happy to read that Professor Hochus in his paper also makes reference to this cardinal and very important point. He states that its fundamental makeup is quasi or quasi-federal, and he continues to list a number of issues that we would refer to as the democratic deficit that are prevalent in the structure of our kingdom. I believe this is a fundamental issue, and I would like to elucidate a bit more why I hold the view that it is a federal structure and why we should continue to develop and implement this view so that we can function as such. I will now give a review of the main characteristics of a federal state. There's a sovereign state consisting of several constituent states, and that answers to our situation. We have the kingdom. The kingdom is the sovereign state, and the countries within the kingdom are the constituent states. There's a constitution of the federal state, and that is the charter, the Kingdom Charter, in which the delimitation of powers is established between the kingdom and the constituent states. And I refer to Article 3 of the Charter. The governmental authorities that belong to the federal state are listed or enumerated. Those that are not, so those governmental authorities that are not listed, and this is based on constitutional law, those competencies are the authority of the constituent states. So what is listed are the authorities of the kingdom, and those that are not listed, all governmental authority that is not listed there belong to the realm of the constituent states. The federal states consist of a federal government and a parliament. That is not well developed in our system. There is a kingdom government, but there's no kingdom parliament. And perhaps later in the discussion or so, we will elaborate more on the structure of the kingdom government, because that's one of the main causes of what we refer to as the democratic deficit. I continue. The federal laws are applicable for all constituent states, and that is a fact in our system, but also in a regular federation or federative state, such as the United States, Brazil, India, Germany. Those are states that have a federal structure. The national laws in the various states are not required to be uniform, and they may differ. The parliament, and this is standard for a federal state, the parliament consists of representatives of all the states. And this point is also not existent or not developed in our structure, and this also forms one of the bottlenecks in the functioning, the proper functioning and democratic functioning of our kingdom structure. The constituent states choose their respective parliaments, and the parliaments appoint the government, and that is the case with us. The constituent states each have their own constitution and are autonomous and have a full measure of self-government in handling their internal affairs. And that is laid down in the charter, but in reality it does not function as such, and that is also one of the areas that we should look at and have it better developed, because the structure is there. The laws of the constituent states are only applicable and enforceable within the state where they were established. That's the case with us, and that is standard in a federal structure. There's no vertical delimitation of powers, but a horizontal delimitation that do not overlap each other's competencies. So what is assigned to the federal state or the kingdom, those are the kingdom matters. And the rest that are not assigned are the matters that pertain to the constituent states. So the constituent state cannot go and regulate a matter that belongs to the kingdom. And the other way around should not be the case also, but we know in our system that that can happen. And these are some of the things that we should look at, and I'm going to come to some recommendations in a short while. There's a constitutional and or a Supreme Court that would settle disputes amongst the kingdom and disputes among the constituent states. We do not have a constitutional court of the kingdom, and this would be one of the recommendations that I would highly recommend. We do have a Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court, as we know it in The Hague, is limited, have some limitation as far as the administration of law is concerned. For instance, the Supreme Court does not have the right to exercise judicial review, so to review the acts of parliaments of the kingdom or of the constituent states. In a federal state, as it is described in constitutional law, the higher supervision, as we know it, does not exist. So there's no other administrative body exercising higher supervision over the constituent states. That is done via the courts, via the Supreme Court, or via a constitutional court. My conclusion, therefore, is that our present kingdom structure possesses all the essential characteristics of a federal state, with the exception of a few points. I think it's D, F, K. Administrative higher supervision, as we know it, does not belong in the structure and should be removed. Taking the aforementioned points into consideration, it is my firm conclusion that the structure is fundamentally that of a federal state and not a unitary state. I got early this morning a reaction from someone who's knowledgeable that read my paper online and told me that on this point he fully agrees with my position. He also mentioned that years ago, and maybe Professor Hochers would know this, that Hirsch-Berlin also made similar references. I do not know about those, but I'm going to go and do the research and look at them as well. And the person also said that he agrees that within the kingdom, we should look at this more closely, because if we can develop the kingdom structure as a federal state, we should be able, and I believe that we will be able to function better within our kingdom. Before I close, let me give some recommendations. And for the other matters about decolonization, I will refer the members and the general public back to my paper. And recently I acquired what we call the Regeringsreglement from 1865. See the professor shaking his head. That's a very important document. I am still reviewing and studying it, but I think it's very, very interesting, because that document is considered as our first constitution. And when you look at it, it's, I think, a modern constitution. Although we were still a colony at that time, it's 2 years after slavery was abolished, but in that document, there were already talks about zelfbestuur and autonomie, which is way before the UN Charter came into existence. And I must admit that the Dutch are very, we would say, sophisticated, because I think at that time we were way ahead of perhaps all the rest, all the other countries. But hopefully later on we can look a bit more at that document, which is a very, very, very interesting document. I'll go down to my recommendations. The above conclusion should be the point of departure in modernizing our charter. I offer the following recommendations for review of the charter. The democratic deficit as it exists should be erased by instituting governmental organs on kingdom level that will allow the constituent states to participate fully in matters pertaining to the kingdom and avoid undue influence in their internal affairs. The government organs of the largest state in the kingdom should no longer be able to administer instructions to the other states in matters of an internal nature. A constitutional court of the kingdom will adjudicate administrative conflicts between the kingdom and the states, as well as disputes among the states. The Supreme Court will administer law in final instance, as the highest court within the kingdom, and should become competent to review all ordinances and acts promulgated by the Kingdom Parliament and the parliaments of the 4 constituent states. The Kingdom government, so the Rijksministerraad, should comprise of the Prime Minister of each state, along with 1 or 2 ministers designated by the Prime Minister. The Parliament of the Kingdom should consist of the Parliament of the 4 constituent states and should continue, I emphasize, to function in a similar manner in which they now function when international treaties, kingdom laws, and consensus laws are being approved. The consensus and the approval of all 4 parliaments are required, and this is anchored in the charter. And I believe that if we do similar with the matters pertaining to the kingdom, that you have all the governments from the 4 countries involved via the Prime Minister and 1 or more designated ministers to come to decisions that pertain to the kingdom. I believe that by doing so, we can improve the unclearness or give more clarity to the structure of our kingdom, and that the kingdom will function in a more democratic manner, because the way that the Rijksministerraad is now comprised of the ministers of the government of the Netherlands and the ministers plenipotentiary who do not have any voting powers is undemocratic, and that is one of the areas that is cause for the democratic deficit. And we live now, the chair mentioned that the parliament is almost 70 years. It's 68 plus, and we live in a modern society. So those old remnants of colonial rule should be removed, and we should get together, sit around the table, and come up with a structure that will function and would be beneficial to all the countries, and in doing so, we will create a stronger bond and a stronger relationship within the kingdom. I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to questions and the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Groeneveld. A very practical and direct approach. The structure, let's look at the structure, change it. In talking about the federal structure and using the United States as an example, we all know very well how the United States is arranged, local governments, federal governments, and in particular, you mentioned the fact that the democratic deficits are the biggest ones, representation, but also disputes, and saying that perhaps a constitutional court for the kingdom or Supreme Court to handle disputes will solve some of those issues. So thank you so much. I would like to move on then next to our presenter, who is a professor in comparative constitutional law at the University of Groningen, Professor Gerard Hoogers. Thank you and welcome. And you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you so much, esteemed Madam Chair. And thank you all for inviting me, the members of Parliament, and in a bigger sense, the people of St. Martin, whom you represent. I will get into that in a moment. For having me here and discussing this very important and interesting topic today. I took the opportunity when I was asked to write a position paper to do that on the topic of, which was one of the possible topics presented, and I took that, the history of the coming into force of the statute and why it is as it is today. And one of the things that always strikes me, and I feel a bit like a child in a toy store now, because there is so much in the presentations already given that I want to react to, but I will force myself to calm down. That will happen later today, probably. There is so much in the coming into existence of the statute, of the charter, and how it developed over time that is very ironic. The first thing that comes to mind then is I was thinking just a couple of minutes ago when the last two MPs joining us today entered the room and signed their presence. We are now in the position, ladies and gentlemen, as we are sitting here, to amend the St. Martin Constitution. It's wonderful, isn't it? 11 of 15 are present, so you have a 2/3 majority. You can now, if you reconvene as the Staten, you can amend the Constitution today. That's of course, that's a joke, but it's also a serious remark, because it shows that St. Martin, as it is, has a constitutional autonomy. You have your own constitution that you have, at least officially, written yourself, that you amend yourself, that you can even, remove entirely and introduce or vervangen, exchange for a new one. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons why that is because of that seal there that says that the Parliament of St. Martin is the coram populo, which is Latin referring to the fact that it's the heart of the people. Which people? The St. Martin people. And that brings us to one of the fundamental choices that the Charter has made in 1954. And it's also important if you look at the question of a democratic deficit. Because usually in a federal makeup, and to bring to rest the possible worries that my esteemed colleague to the right has of my federal inclinations, I have been accused of being a federalist in the dissertation of none other than Dr. Raisund Santos Nascimento from the University of Aruba, who wrote a dissertation a couple of years ago on the Charter, and who in a rather, well, he doesn't mean it that friendly when he calls me a federalist. So there you go. I am, deep down inside, I'm a federalist, just like you, when it comes to the kingdom. But okay. that aside for the moment, when the statute came into force in 1954, as I've tried to show in my position paper, it was not something that appeared out of the blue air, out of the thin blue air. It was a document that followed from a long development that was basically introduced, obviously, as it goes in colonial settings in the Netherlands proper. A discussion that was originally a discussion among Dutchmen, among Dutch politicians and among Dutch scholars on the future of the kingdom. And it was also a discussion that was originally mainly focused on the future relationship between the Netherlands and the Netherlands East Indies. Because basically everybody from the 1920s onward who had any inclination of what the Netherlands East Indies were like realized that in the longer term it would be impossible for the Netherlands to control an empire in East Asia the size of Europe, by what? Saying that it's ours? Threatening to use force? What kind of force? I mean, we tried it after the Second World War. It backfired, obviously, because the Netherlands was already in the 1920s not in a position to control an empire, I repeat, the size of Europe by military means. Nor was the Netherlands in the position to make the kind of economic investments that would be necessary to lift up such a country to the standards of the Netherlands, and in doing that trying to gain, enough goodwill. So basically everybody who had any sense of the subject realized that somehow, if the Netherlands would be to continue a position in the Netherlands East Indies, that would be dependent upon, in the end, the goodwill of the locals. So how do you obtain that goodwill? Well, from the 1920s onward, more and more Dutch scholars and even Dutch politicians started to believe that would somehow it would be necessary to convince the Indonesians from the fact that it would be better to remain with the Netherlands in a constitutional union of whatever composition than to become independent. How would that be obtainable? We started to believe that the way to do that was to gradually introduce forms of self-government. Now that is important, because the French, for instance, who had the same problem, who also in the 1920s looked at their empire and thought, are we going to hold on to that? In the longer term, not for the coming 20, 30 years, but in a century? They believed that the way to do that would be to more and more incorporate the colonies into France, to turn colonial subjects into Frenchmen. I sometimes joke to my students in the Netherlands that in the French colonial system, if over time you could convincingly show that you were able to wear an alpino pet and have a French bread under your arm and smell a bit of garlic, then you could turn into a proper Frenchman, get voting rights in French Parliament, and get French citizenship. I mean, that's a joke, obviously, too, but there is also a sense of reality to that, because the French worked with a system of citizens' axioms. If you passed such an axiom, you became a French citizen, you got voting rights, and the theory was that over time, more and more of the colonial subjects would, through passing those axioms, get French citizenship, and in the long run, all the colonies would simply be parts of France and, would be just France, like France in France itself. And remnants of that, obviously, on this island can be seen on the other side of the border. I mean, most of the French law are valid there. Most of Dutch laws are not valid here for the reasons explained by my colleague to the right. So, self-government is a very typical Dutch way of looking at autonomy, at emancipation, and perhaps in the long run, decolonization. We have never believed in the Netherlands that decolonization would or should take place through incorporation in the Netherlands, but always through giving more and more power to local organs that would have to be legitimized by local persons, by people living there. The Charter follows that fundamental idea. The reason that there is not a kingdom parliament is not that that was not an idea discussed. It was discussed extremely very, very intensively in the early 1950s. It was discussed in the Netherlands itself, it was discussed with Suriname and the Antilles, but no convincing solution could be found. And so in the end, this came out. The idea that there would not be a kingdom parliament, but that each of the countries, then the Netherlands, Antilles, and Suriname, would have their own parliament. And that these parliaments would formally be on a par. The three parliaments of the three countries, or as we have now, the four parliaments of the four countries. And yes, the Dutch parliament would then also sort of double as the parliament of the kingdom. And the idea was that that was not ideal, but it was defensible, and that was then also believed in the end by Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles, that it was defensible because the kingdom had such few powers, mainly defense and foreign affairs and a few others, and those were not that important. And even in the fields of defense and foreign affairs, well, then Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles would have a lot of space to develop their own ideas on that. You know, the whole idea of everything that was a bit more, perhaps, how do you say, gevoelig?
Sensitive.
Sensitive, thank you. In this sense, you can also use this word. Sometimes I have to search for an English word. All of the, for instance, military conscriptness, that would be a country affair, not a kingdom affair. There would be one kingdom army, but not with conscripts of all the 4 countries. No, that would be a country affair if there would be military conscription and how it would be organized. So the whole idea was that, yes, the overseas countries would not be represented formally in the Dutch parliament when it dealt with kingdom matters, but it wouldn't be such a problem because there were very few kingdom matters, and for the rest, you know, the kingdom would abstain from interfering in the relationships of the countries. The whole, if you look back at all these documents from the early 1950s, the whole idea of the charter was basically to create a minimum state, if you will. A state in which the 3 partners would be as autonomous as possible without completely cutting constitutional ties. That was, of course, because this whole concept was not developed for Suriname and for the Netherlands Antilles, but for Indonesia. It was the idea, it is as if it is a jacket that was tailored for a very big man, and the very big man chose not to wear it, but the jacket was already made. Or it was perhaps not already entirely made, but the idea for the jacket, the concept of the jacket was already developed. And the smaller men who were still within the kingdom, not smaller in any intellectual sense, but simply from population and territory-wise, the smaller men within the kingdom said, that's a jacket that would fit us. And of course, the Netherlands could then no longer say, yes, but the jacket was never meant for you. The jacket was for Indonesia. You're too small for such a jacket. I mean, it was promised by the Queen, right? Things that are promised by the Queen in 1942, you can't say later on, sure, the Queen promised that, but not to you. No, it was a promise made to the entire kingdom. So, the Netherlands itself struggled with the idea that such an enormous jacket would be fitted on the shoulders of small partners. And that was, I'm absolutely sure of the fact that if Indonesia somehow would have chosen to remain within the kingdom, there would be no democratic deficit. I mean, it's for me, it's absolutely clear that there would have been a solution for a kingdom government in that scenario. But in the scenario that only Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles were left, I mean, the commission of Logeman tried to come up with a solution for these 3 in 1948. And one of the ironies, and I will come to a conclusion, but Madam Chair, if you will, allow me to give one other irony in a few minutes. But one of the ironies of the kingdom is that one of the reasons that this whole structure with a true kingdom parliament was rejected was not just that the Netherlands did no longer believe in it, but also that this structure came in the framework of an entire kingdom constitution that was beautiful. I mean, it was a beautiful document that Logeman created. He was a professor of constitutional law. We are clever people. So if you allow us to write a document, we come up with something beautiful. But this kingdom constitution was also a constitution that contained a lot of material norms that would have been binding on all the partners, including Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles, and therefore would have been a diminishment of autonomy. Because if you're bound by such a kingdom constitution that contains all kinds of material norms, you have to abide by them. For instance, there was a whole catalogue of fundamental rights on the kingdom level, which means that Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles would have been bound by these fundamental rights on the kingdom level. So they would still have been able to create their own Charter of Fundamental Rights, but they would have been subject, obviously from a federal point of view, to the hierarchically superior federal fundamental rights. Now, and I don't have to explain to you as parliamentarians what the dynamics is of a complete catalogue of fundamental rights. I mean, the United States perfectly shows how important the Bill of Rights in the federal constitution has been to limit the autonomy of the states. the US states are bound by a lot of material norms developed by the Supreme Court on the basis of the Federal Bill of Rights. They can't do a lot of things anymore that they used to be able to do in the 19th century because of that. So it's a bit of careful what you wish for. And one of the reasons that all the three partners then decided this federal constitution, we're not going to go on with that, is that it would probably have been a severe limit on the autonomy of Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles. And one of the reasons that Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles decided to abide by the Charter with its democratic deficit is the fact that it would guarantee a lot of autonomy. Now, in my paper, I explained but I wrote a paragraph on why that autonomy is now and objectively defensible too, is seen as diminished, not because of any amendment to the Charter, but because of developments in the relationship between the country Netherlands and the three other countries. And we will probably get into that later today as well. So there is something ironic to it. You know, the democratic deficit exists partly because otherwise perhaps the autonomy of the Netherlands Antilles and Suriname would have been more limited than was envisioned by, all three of the partners in the early 1950s. And the second irony, which brings me to the end of my presentation, is my colleague to the right referred to that in his presentation as well, the lack of constitutional review. Again, in the late 1940s and early 1950s, constitutional review was all over the place. My fellow countrymen have completely forgotten that. I mean, basically every Dutch constitutional lawyer or other lawyer presently believes that we have a long tradition, going back to the 19th century of, the Dutch constitutional history is we don't do constitutional review. It's always been in the Constitution, which is true. But after the Second World War, for a few years, there was a wide open window onto a possible different future in which constitutional review would have been very important. Both the Dutch-Indonesian Union, envisioned in 1946 by the Linggadjati Agreement, and Logeman's constitutional framework of 1948 foresaw very important roles for constitutional review by constitutional courts, both on the level of the Dutch-Indonesian Union and on the level of the restructured kingdom. So there would have been two constitutional courts, one on the, if you will, multinational level of the Dutch-Indonesian Union and on the level of the restructured kingdom, that would have far-reaching powers of constitutional review. In fact, and a colleague of mine in Nijmegen, whom I value a lot, Jozef Fleuren, has done a lot of research into this, and he has shown me a couple of examples of this. In the early 1950s, there are in fact a few examples of Dutch judges who actually did review of Dutch acts on the Dutch-Indonesian Union. And especially on, here we go again, the Charter of Fundamental Rights in the Indonesian Union, in the Charter. So, but because the Dutch-Indonesian Union was basically a stillborn experiment, it went nowhere, for reasons I've shown in my paper, and because the Charter in Article 49 uses a wording for constitutional review that is a bit hesitant, you could read that article as if, the Charter sort of envisions it as a question to be answered by the legislator of the realm. Whereas if you look at the constitutional history, that was not how it was envisioned. It was envisioned as an article that states, yes, there is the power of review, but the legislator can regulate how this is to be organized. But that has been completely forgotten since the middle of the 1950s. Which explains why the Hoge Raad in 1989 could say, no, constitutional review, we never did that in the Harmonisatiewet arrest. Where they give a sort of a historical overview of developments that, with all due respect, is bullshit. What the Hoge Raad says there is nonsense. Yes, it is. It's nonsense. I mean, especially historically speaking, it's nonsense what they say. But they don't know that, because they themselves and their legal advisors had forgotten what had happened in the early 1950s. So And that's also very ironic. I mean, we were on a way, like I said, to a possible future in which there would be no democratic deficit and no lack of constitutional review, but that future did not happen. A different future happened. The future that is our present. And we can perhaps today look into ways in which we can perhaps revive aspects of that possible future of the late 1940s in our future. Which brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Professor Hochers. I think you did quite the job reminding us of the complexities, actually, of this charter of the kingdom, but reminding us as well to look at the history of the Netherlands and the Indonesian Constitutional Union. And it was important to also give a contrast, right? The French model being a more hands-on, inclusive, and the Dutch model being a little bit more hands-off, but also now with increased autonomy, we're saying there is a democratic deficit and there needs to be change. I want to mention to the committee as well that our brothers and sisters in the Dutch Caribbean were invited to tune in. So we hope that they are tuned in, especially ahead of IPCO, which is soon. And so I think this conversation is extremely important, this discussion, as we move forward. And so I would then like to come to our final presenter, author of Comparative Government Politics, a scholar, and the director of the St. Martin Institute for Public Policy Studies, Mr. Julio Romney. You have the floor, sir.
Honorable Madam Chair, members of Parliament, listening audience, good morning. It gives me great pleasure to have this opportunity to be part of this first ever panel of experts roundtable discussion on the Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, with the main objective to avail information and advice on initiating an approach to amending the Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands. And I thank the Committee for Constitutional Affairs for this opportunity. When I was approached to be part of this esteemed panel discussion, I readily agreed for three important reasons. First, felt honored to be invited by the Committee for Constitutional Affairs and Decolonization of the Parliament of St. Martin to share my professional knowledge as a scholar of comparative government and politics. Second, I accepted the invitation to identify myself with the noble objectives of the Committee for Constitutional Affairs, which seeks to provide parliamentary oversight, coordination of, and reporting on a trajectory towards decolonization as per UN Charter, as well as handling of constitutional matters. My most important reason, however, for accepting this invitation has to do with the subject matter, or rather the premises of the discussion. Basically, that is the bringing of kingdom into balance begins with that in mind and acting accordingly. In the invitation, it was requested to examine one of the following themes. First, the creation of the Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the Charter Anno 2021. Secondly, Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands as it relates to United Nations in terms of decolonization. And fourthly, democratic deficit within the kingdom. As to the creation of the Charter for the Kingdom of the Netherlands, There should be no doubt that this charter, meaning the charter, was created with political participation of St. Martin as part of the Netherlands Antilles. I guess one can then make reference to United Nations General Assembly coordination of communication relating to the cessation of transmission of information under Article 73E of the Charter, report on the Fourth Committee, and there's also, one can refer back again to the General Assembly communication of the 557th meeting of December 1955. And again, one can make reference to to the amendment of the Charter on the 1st of November 2010, agreed to again by St. Martin. So in essence, by our own free will, we have been decolonized to that extent. In regard to the Kingdom of the Netherlands, as it relates to the United Nations in terms of decolonization, this process was completed under the United Nations Resolution 94510, again during the 557th plenary meeting of the United Nations General Assembly on December 15, 1955. Thus, in essence, during that meeting, we are declared a self-governing territory, thus decolonized. So in essence, stating. Whereas related to the democratic deficit within the kingdom, there is the apparent assumption that there is a democratic deficit in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. I contend that there is no democratic deficit in the Kingdom of the Netherlands. Conversely, I have chosen to discuss the democratic deficit in the kingdom and present the moot case. Okay. Granted, there is the notion that there is a democratic deficit within the kingdom. We must clearly now define what is a democratic deficit. Basically, a democratic deficit arises when seemingly democratic institutions, usually government, fail to fulfill what they are supposed to do for the principles of democracy. For example, they are the presence of electoral threshold, special majorities, insufficient weighing of the vote of parliaments and decisions. Okay? And this is the case that we see clearly within the Netherlands, or rather within the kingdom, where we see probably the council consisting, or rather the government of the kingdom, consisting of 12 to 16 persons from the Netherlands, and probably one minister of plenipotentiary from each of the islands, or the countries. Nonetheless, democratic deficit, or on the other hand, that is described or arises whenever the set of those involved in making democratic decisions fail to coincide with the rest of those affected by them. This is quite evident or prevalent within the kingdom, as the governance structure of the kingdom is not responsive to legitimacy. For this reason, we see that there's, in essence, no democratic deficit, but an issue with legitimacy. Legitimacy, again, as I stated earlier, it's being a government that legitimate, in a sense that it provides equal representation, or rather that all the countries within the kingdom can be truly identified within this thing. If one looks at democratic deficit in terms of saying, okay, we need to have equal representation, if you want to put it that way. Okay, what is equality? Equality does not necessarily mean that the numbers must be correctly. And if one truly looking at democracy, then what? There must be that proportional representation. Proportional representation, he means, one, take a close look. The Netherlands has a population approximately 17.5 million. St. Martin, 63,000. Where's democracy in terms of 63,000, or if you want to put the complete, all the other three islands or countries, would give them approximately 300,000. How could one expect, or would they want and see that 3,000 people, of our citizens, are ruling 17.5? See, it's important, it's imperative that we put these things into context. In essence, if there was a deficit in democracy, then one would say, okay, we do not have equal representation. But I must impress, we do have equal representation. If one goes a step further and looking at a formula of proportional representation, this is the most accurate mathematical equation one can use in terms of providing proportional representation. If we go by that formula, or any formula that says proportional representation, granted, the rest of the other islands, including St. Martin, would have what? No representation. I mean, if one look at it by ratio, 17.5 by 63,000, there will be no representation. Okay? Well, we can say, look hard and close at that and try to find out a way of closing that gap, an alternative, so to speak, because we do realize that within the kingdom government, that the other countries have no influence. So one option, and when we're looking again proportional representation, giving the Netherlands its representation by population, we said, okay, we can then employ a system of 40, 20, 20, 20 percentage in terms of that body that constitute the kingdom government. And here, the kingdom, or rather the Netherlands, would then still have that advantage, if you want to put it that way. And it's basically it's not an advantage. It's basically in proportion to their population. Their population would have the representatives because of the number of persons. And what advantage here then is that the kingdom in itself would not be able to dictate, so to speak, public policy without the input, or rather the agreement of at least one of the other islands. And at the same token, the other countries cannot dictate for the much larger constituency within the kingdom. So that in itself gives it some kind of balance. And I'll go back again and I'll say the key problem here is what? Democratic legitimacy. And what that means now, that basically within that whole system, that other countries, they don't feel part of it. They're not part of the system, so to speak, in terms of that it could be identified with it. And I noticed a number of other, like I said, within 10 minutes, that's kind of, limited time in order to explain. And I would hope that persons would go to the website, or if you could question me, and look at the paper, at my paper, and read it. And I'm sure that when we go through this whole system, or this whole panel discussion, it will come crystal clear that there is no democratic deficit. If one looks at when democratic deficit arises, okay? An alternative here is what? To increase the legitimacy of the kingdom government. And in the paper, one can go back, and stated a number of different areas where you go for civil engagement, and that's basically trying to get the whole countries of the other countries of the kingdom to be identified, to be recognized within. And I must say the cardinal mistake here was made here was during the decolonization process, or preparing for the decolonization process if you had. Because in essence, one goes when one looks at nation building, or in our case, constituent state construction, we were not identified. We were given a parliamentary system or governing system. It was thrust upon us. Okay? They were not really concerned with our culture. They were not concerned with our language. Okay? And one can go back and look at the steps involved in constituent state construction. You see one of the key things is what? Legitimacy. You must be able to identify within that system. You must have political participation within that system. And there we have failed. Or rather, we have not failed. They have failed in giving us. Okay. So I go at it, we talk about, and like I said, during the whole discussion, trust that this will come more apparent. And we have to find ways to increase our legitimacy. And this in itself cannot be legislated. It must be, we must come together and then form that kind of consensus building, and that through different formulation of policies coming together, identifying ways and means that we can be part of this whole system. And one of the key things here, and one will notice that within our system, or part of, there's quite a deal of politicization. That is one of our key problems. Everything is politicized. So therefore, what decreases our legitimacy? If we look at, pull one under hat, coho, is politicized. They are using that more of a sense to increase their political advancement within the kingdom, or even here. We'll find it even among us in our community, or our politicians. They would use some things, right, to advance their political desire, as opposed for the goodness or for the objective of St. Martin. And that is one of the main problems here. Okay? And of course, that's difficult to separate. Okay? So we have to find ways and means of doing this. Okay? And I said I'm trying to stay within my 10 minutes, and I trust that as we go on, and during the panel discussion, that we can resolve this. Or rather, it's nothing to resolve per se, but we can understand. Okay? One has to step back. And even in our ways of thinking, which is important here, we think of a republic, and I must remind folks, the kingdom is not a republic. Okay? It's a constitutional monarchy. So that's important again. You cannot find the principles of democracy within an autocracy system. Therefore, you cannot find the principles of a republic within a constitutional monarchy. See, and if we're going to get on further into this, my colleague talked about putting together, or rather saying we're going to get a parliamentary, not a federal structure. Here again, I implore, I understand wanting a federal structure, good, bad, indifferent. Would it be able to advance our legitimization within the kingdom? I beg to say no. Because if you put a parliamentary, or rather a federal structure into place, in essence, what? We can have federal government, which has what? Majority of the powers. And the constituent state would have the least. And of course, within the literature, there's much talk about the system of government is a federal structure. Here again, that is highly debatable. It is more of a confederation as opposed to a federation. Confederation meaning what? Powers lie within these constituencies and move upwards, as opposed to a federal where the power, majority of the power lies on top and then goes down to the states. So in essence, if one looks at the body of the literature, here there's a person saying that it has some elements of a federal structure, but in essence, it's more of a confederation, where you find what? All of the islands, all of the constituent territories has most of the power, and then few. If one looks at a charter, there are what, 9, 10, 15, less than that, that is delegated for the kingdom government. And mind you again, the kingdom government is what? The administrative arm of these things. So in essence, the constituent states of the kingdom has considerably power, more so than the 50 states within the United States, which form a federal structure. So I beg, we have to look at this in context. Good, we want to change the charter. There might be some things that might change the charter. But in essence, what needs to be done here is increasing and find ways and means of increasing the legitimacy of the kingdom government. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Romney, for your perspective on this topic, and specifically saying, in your opinion, there is no democratic deficit, but rather a need for an increase in democratic legitimacy.
That's correct.
And it's about the people not identifying with what we currently have and not being able to participate as much politically, but proportional representation being present and adequate, in your opinion. Thank you for that perspective. I believe that we will have quite the discussion moving forward. We have come to the end of the presentation of all the panelists. What we will do now is take a very short 2-minute adjournment. And when we return, members of parliament will be able to ask questions directly to the panelists, and that debate can ensue. So we will adjourn for 2 minutes, and we'll be right back. Welcome back, everyone, to this meeting of the Committee of Constitutional Affairs and Decolonization. I would like to thank the panelists one more time for their presentations today. I now open the floor to members of Parliament. First, I must say that for this discussion to be as dynamic as possible, the idea is that each member asks one question directed to a panelist or to the entire panel. Panelists can rebut answers from a panelist, and then we move on to the next member and so forth, just to keep the conversation and discussion going. I must also mention or remind us to limit or to prohibit our use of any colorful language. I know the discussion might probably get quite heated, and so just to watch our language on the floor. I must also ask the public as well to send in questions. There is a link on our Facebook page, and this link can be filled in, and questions will then be collected. And once we return from our lunch break at 1:30, questions from the public will then be asked. But for now, the floor is open to members of Parliament. Our first MP is MP Emmanuel. MP Emmanuel, you have the floor.
Madam Chair Lady, I thank you very much. I saw things coming in on the speaker's list. Didn't know I was the one up on the podium to be the first speaker, but I thank you very much nonetheless for that. Let me say good morning to the esteemed panelists that we have here, my honorable colleagues and the people of St. Martin. I am always intrigued, and I like these types of conversation next to discussing the Bible and religion. It always goes in different directions. Nonetheless, Madam Chair, I want to get into a few of the points that I picked up from the panel, and I must admit that in all of the discussion that I have heard, the word independence was mentioned only once, and that's when the gentleman, Mr. Kroeneveld, made mention of it. And that will be a question to the whole panel. I wonder why it wasn't made mention from all of the position papers that was presented by the individuals. Nonetheless, Madam Chair Lady, I want to get to this point because this is an issue that I am plagued with for a very long time after diving into the Kingdom Charter when I listened to Professor Hookers, and he made mention that it was made and directly tailored for Indonesia. And yes, I can agree for that. But the part that I take sort of a different direction is, Madam Chair Lady, is when he made mention that here we are over in the former colonies of Curacao and his dependencies, looked at it and said, you know what, even though this jacket is big or was made for a big person, we would want it to see if we can fit in it. No, I take a different angle and sort of don't agree with that part of it. And here's my reason why. Madam Chair Lady, you got to understand back then what was happening during that period of time. Here you have, how should I call it, Europe just coming out of a war, if I should say this. And Europe was on their knees. And what you're getting is America sort of extending their hands to help Europe get back up and going with the doctrine and saying that, listen, we are going to fund, we're going to put in this, and we're going to get you back. So it's not that, because at that time, Holland really wanted to keep Indonesia. They wanted to keep Indonesia. One, because of the population and the resources that is in Java and all of the other surrounding parts of the geography. They wanted to keep it. They were pressured by America to release Indonesia. Why? Because coming into the establishment of NATO, America needed Europe to be on their knees to fight and keep NATO growing because of Russia. So if Holland kept Indonesia, their resources would have been in abundance in terms of the diamonds, in terms of gold, in terms of lumber, in terms of oil, in terms of everything else. Indonesia would have made Holland much more richer and powerful than it is and wouldn't have needed America. So that would have sort of been, how should I put it, an Achilles heel. My time is running out. Oh my goodness, well then we can't have this conversation. Okay. Okay, so then my number one question, do you really believe that the Kingdom Charter would have replaced the democratic deficit if Indonesia had kept it? That would be my question. I'm
So,
sorry, I can't-
to Professor
Professor
Hochers first,
yeah.
and then,
Yeah.
okay, Professor Hochers, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If Indonesia would have stayed within the kingdom, we would not have the charter as it is today. Something else, but something a bit like it would have been created, I think. Obviously, it's always like looking into a crystal ball because things didn't turn out that way. But what I always find interesting, and it's, I mean, I'm quite sure that you follow some of the discussion going on in the Netherlands now about the politionele acties and, you know, the terror that, let's just call it what it is, if you would allow me to use that word, the terror that Dutch troops have enacted upon Indonesian civilians in villages and what have you not during what, it's a bit like what Putin does, right? We were not allowed to call it a war. Obviously it was a war, but it was called politionele acties for a long time. Well, but what always strikes me is that looking back, because I totally agree with you that when in August 1945, when Sukarno and Hatta declared independence, and a few days later, that news became known in the Netherlands, basically everybody was within the provisional government was completely shocked, and everybody was of the conviction that if this would happen, the Netherlands could not rebuild. How were we supposed to rebuild the Netherlands without the resources from Indonesia? India verloren, rampspoed geboren was it's hard to translate because it rhymes so beautifully in Dutch, but Indonesia lost rampspoed, how would you translate that? Catastrophe is going to happen, something like that. So and that was on the lips of great parts of the population and of the politicians. But that was in August 1945. In the summer of 1946, an agreement was reached with those same Indonesian nationalists. So within 9 months, the Dutch government accepted that Indonesia would not remain within the kingdom. That everything that the Queen had talked about in 1942 would no longer happen that way for Indonesia. And everything that happened after that was trying to, if necessarily, force Indonesia to negotiate with the Netherlands on terms of independence that were as acceptable as possible for the Netherlands, so that Dutch economic interests would be secured in an independent Indonesia, that Dutch companies would still be able to, and that Dutch citizens would be able to live in Indonesia, things like that. But that Indonesia would become independent was clear by the summer of 1946, and it's very tragic that it cost so many lives and that it would cause so much violence and bloodshed and destruction before in 1949 Indonesia became independent in the end, because the principle of Indonesian independence was accepted in 46. And to end my answer, I'm convinced that if somehow Sukarno during those negotiations would have said, okay, we accept autonomy within the Dutch kingdom, the chances of that were nil. But let's assume for a second that Sukarno would have said, okay, you know, thinking better of it, what we did a few months ago, declaring independence, nah, forget about it. We're going to remain within the Dutch kingdom. We're going to accept autonomy. And those negotiations would have been fruitful, and Indonesia would have been an autonomous part within the Dutch kingdom. Then there would have been a kingdom parliament in which Indonesia would have a big say. Because if I look at the presentation that Mr. Whitley just gave, here we have in 1947, 70 million people, compared to in the Netherlands proper back then 9 million. So there would be less chance than a snowflake has in hell that Indonesia would have accepted a kingdom structure in which these 65 million people would not have been adequately represented. it would probably have been a hard bargain for the Netherlands to come up with a solution in which the Netherlands would still be somehow properly represented in that structure in which they would now have been a minor partner and the junior partner. So, essentially speaking, and again, history is full of ironies, it was basically probably in the Dutch interest as well that a structure would have been developed in which Indonesia became independent, so the kingdom would have remained something in which the Netherlands proper were the big player. Because in a kingdom in which Indonesia would have retained, I mean, the government would now be in Jakarta. Probably. Or something like that. Yes, because, I mean, if you would have been looking at and if you would have followed the democratic logic, then the people of the kingdom would have, majorly speaking, you know, and presently more than 200 million Indonesians. I mean, we would have been the annex to the kingdom, probably. We would probably no longer be a kingdom, I think, if Indonesia would have remained within the kingdom, and the kingdom would have been really a democratic kingdom, or turned into a democratic. So it was, in the end, ironically speaking, it was also in our interest that Indonesia became independent.
Thank you, Professor Hoogers. I look to the panelists, first Dr. Ardern and then Mr. Rumley.
Thank you so very much for that explanation and, in fact, the question. In fact, it emphasized my take on the whole process, because we see clearly that in the charter being shifted to really attention of the Caribbean Dutch, yeah, it's an afterthought, yes? And if we do not look at the where we are today in that sense, it was an afterthought. And what happened over the years, if we do not bring back the charter and the laws back to the realities of the time and thereafter, we will continue to discuss whether it's a federation, whether that. Of course, those discussions are very important. However, putting it in the proper perspective, based on that question, we'll see, yes, okay, what do we have to do with it today then? Because not only the discussion between Indonesia and the Netherlands, but as Professor Hoge said in his presentation, initial presentation, yes, who were around, who negotiated it? The Dutch politicians and Dutch civil servants. The people at this side of the ocean, they didn't even really worry whether it's a federation, a confederation. And we have to look at that part of the reality. And now that we have St. Martin as an autonomous country, review all of these issues, but don't make the same mistake to discuss the form without taking in consideration the constellation of St. Martin today. Because while it will the colonists being part of the discussions in the 1950s, yes, which led to a charter with all the consequences, for example, of 1969 within the Netherlands, if we don't take in consideration now that 70% of our populations are newcomers, and we don't include that reality in our negotiations, we will have, next 20, 30 years, similar discussions. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Ardern. Mr. Rumley?
Madam Chair, I think it's imperative that we take things into perspective. Okay? If we want to move forward, if St. Martin wants to move forward, good, history is all good and dandy. But we have to look where we are today. And like the good parliamentarian MP talked about, where if Indonesia was part of the kingdom, would there be no deficit? Here again, implying that there is a deficit. I guess we must implore, what is the definition? When does deficit, democratic deficit arises? Deficit means what? We don't have that equal representation. Equal does not mean equal in a sense. Equal means by the population we have equal representation. And therefore, there is no democratic deficit. So if we want to evolve, if we want to move forward, we must first come to realize that we must know where we are in order to get where we want to go. So it's imperative that today we understand there is no democratic deficit, because what? In essence, we have equal representation. As a matter of fact, we have more than equal representation. Of course, it doesn't appear that way because they have 16, we have 1. But folks, again, 17.5 versus 63,000. So in order to get where we want to go, we must first realize where we are. We don't have to be satisfied. We don't have to stay there, but we have to realize where we are so then we can effectively move forward.
Thank you, Mr. Romney. I give the floor to Mr. Groeneveld.
Thank you, Madam Chair. May I make 2 short comments? First, the Member of Parliament, Mr. Emmanuel, mentioned about independence. I made a reference to our option, the right to self-determination, that can be used at any time so that we can become independent. I think that was where I was discussing the matter of decolonization. I also referred to the Montevideo Convention that shows that as a constituent state, we have the qualities, we meet all the requirements to become an independent state. So what we have done is voluntarily we have accepted not to become independent, but to form an association with the other countries within the kingdom. In the charter, we are given autonomy. But what we have to do is look and see how that autonomy is functioning. Because we have it, but then in other areas in the charter, like the higher supervision, and I'm going to mention it, Mr. Romney, the democratic deficit limits our autonomy. And those are the things we have to look at and correct. And my last statement on this topic would be, it should not be about numbers who have more population. It's a fact the Netherlands have the biggest population. They have the most expertise. They have the most finances. So on that level, we can never say we want to be equal. But the Netherlands is also part of the European common market. And they have a small population compared to Germany and France. And there they have worked out a system where they are treated equal. And I think if we go back to the recommendation that I made, you would see I'm not recommending that we vote for a kingdom parliament. No, the charter already provides that the parliaments that are voted for in each constituent state actually forms together the kingdom parliament. And I'm recommending the same be done where it pertains to the Kingdom Council of Ministers, the elected prime minister, and then the prime minister could say, okay, I need a minister of finance for this meeting, or another meeting I need a minister of justice. That will comprise a kingdom government. And thinking about elections and proportional representation is not going to do it. And we have to look at the charter, and no system, I said it just now in a small discussion, have all the elements of a federal state. They use some but we have to use those elements that will provide for our needs and for our structure so that we can function optimally. And by doing that, if every country can function and create the services for their people on their level, then we will have a better kingdom of the Netherlands. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Groeneveld. Dr. Ardern.
Indeed, I did not react to the question about independence, why it was not mentioned. As I said, I'm really sitting here to advocate, in fact, for the people, for the reality. And when we take the right of self-determination, you can use that right for autonomy or independence. I'm not a person that like window dressing. I like reality. And going through the history, looking at how we reached here, it is important then, okay, it's 2010, we have to look at how did we use the autonomy that we achieved in 2010. At that, we have to really evaluate, because I am a person, I'm not so good at using just terms. Terms have to have contents, they have to have substance. So we can say, yes, but with our self-determined right of self-determination, we want independence. Let's evaluate how we used the autonomy, how we used our responsibilities and our accountabilities and move forward. I believe that that is something very important. That's why I didn't even touch on independence. But as you saw in my an opinion paper, I stress the importance of the population, the community, assuming commitment. Because if a population is not committed to whatever form you choose for your country, it will fail. And I have given certain steps to consider in our evaluation and moving forward. My recommendations were, and for the public that might not have read the entire paper, utilize the following steps: rediscovery and recovery to establish how the country reached here. This is what you're doing now. Secondly, mourning. Mourning is part of being angry, being confused, but we have to go through those stages to create a collective consciousness depending on no other, and utilize the acquired autonomy to design improved relations within the kingdom or otherwise. For example, independence. If consciously, collectively, we have decided, hey, we want to take more responsibility, we want that commitment. I recommend the next step, dreaming to map out a clear, sustainable future for the country. Commitment of all main players, locally, but also intra-regional. And finally, the actions following up on agreements made. St. Martin should take the lead as an autonomous partner. Because if we can look at it now, did we follow up on agreements made thus far? So my part in this whole discussion is really going at reality checks.
Thank you, Dr. Ardern. I'm going to give the floor quickly for 1 minute for closing rebuttal to MP Emmanuel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You see the democratic deficit in terms of the speaking time? We just don't have that leisure. Nonetheless, I have to agree with Groeneveld, and I wanted to address the issue with Mr. Rumley when he make mention there is no deficit. There is, but you can't base it on the numbers, because California is 40 million people in comparison to New York, which is 20 million. But New York has 2 senators, and so does California. that makes it equal. So California can't turn around and tell New York, because I'm bigger, larger, and more population, I want to have more. So if you have to base it simply on you saying 17 million versus 60,000, there can't be a democratic deficit, because one won't give up that amount of power to a smaller population, makes it itself a democratic deficit. I want to thank you for that.
Thank you, MP Manuel. And Mr. Romney, you can rebut quickly.
And I just want us to regress for a second and see, I mean, words matters, what democratic deficit means. And when you're talking about within the United States, and again, we must come in, within the United States, we're talking a republic as opposed to a constitutional monarchy. But we're going to rest that aside. Within the United States, you're talking about California and New York. Yeah, within the United States, there is what? Democratic deficit, without question. How they address that? And then we're looking at the levels of government. We're talking about what? Within the federal structure, the main executive body, the president. That's the reason we have electoral college, to minimize that democratic deficit. See? So therefore, the more populated states would get more representation. Without question, there appears to be a democratic deficit. And we must understand it. I am not saying that there's something wrong with the math here. Without question, there is. Because here you find that the kingdom, or rather the Netherlands, okay, can influence our politics. And that should not be so. And I said, yes, it should not be so. That's one reason here I recommend the alternative, 40-20-20. Therefore, the kingdom, or the Netherlands, has the majority of representation in sense because of their population. At the same time, the other islands are not totally subjected to that. So therefore, what? You got 20. And other islands, again, cannot, with 300,000, cannot come together and overrule this, so to speak. So it's trying to get you to bring in a whole concept of legitimacy, to show that the kingdom is legitimate, or there's some sort of, we feel part of, because we cannot be totally dominated by them. And at the same time, giving the Netherlands their due respect as having the majority. Don't get me wrong. Yes, there's something fundamentally wrong with that, without question. But we have to put it in perspective and see what the best way we could address it without what? Upsetting the other side.
Thank you, Mr. Romney. And I'm going to go to the next speaker. MP Peterson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. A good afternoon to our honored speakers, our guests, my honorable colleagues, and all of those tuning in. Madam Chair, I would like to stay on the same topic that we're discussing right now, the democratic deficit, because I think that in the whole calculation to basically conclude that we don't have a democratic deficit, there seems to be a sort of a disconnect. The Dutch system is based on evenredige vertegenwoordiging. We are mixing it up with the U.S. electoral system, which is a plurality system. But, for example, I can direct myself to Mr. Romney right now and say, I agree that 63,000, if you divide it by 17.5 million, it's going to give a very low number. But then again, I would say, let's look at the voting population for St. Martin. That's about 14,000 people. Let's say that St. Martin had a right to vote when it comes to the parliament, that is the parliament for the kingdom, which is, in this case, the Tweede Kamer. So out of the 151 candidates that can be chosen, one of those was somebody who is a local, Jurien Wouter, and she got in with 16,000 votes. So who's to say that we as St. Martin cannot rightfully elect a representative to be in said parliament? Or For example, if Curacao does it, they can probably elect 2 or 3 more, depending on which party they look at. So it really depends on how you try to look at the numbers to justify whether or not there is a democratic deficit. But I think the deficit is more in the sense that we, as the countries, do not have a say when it comes to the legislative branch of the kingdom, which is the kingdom parliament, then, which Mr. Groeneveld suggested. We don't have any say in that. We only have somebody that's in the Kingdom Council of Ministers, and to that extent, they don't even have concrete voting rights. So the democratic deficit is not only a numbers issue, it is a fact that we, as a part of the kingdom, are not represented to the extent that we feel that we should be on the kingdom level. So the whole numbers aspect, I would want to take it out of it, because of course, if you divide that number, you're going to get a very low factor. But again, Ms. Judy Wouter was elected with 16,000 votes, and I believe the voting population in Curacao is more than 40,000, so that we can definitely elect some members to be in the, let's say, the kingdom parliament. So to that extent, I would want to bring my question forward, and this is for the whole panel. Of course, I know Mr. Groeneveld's insight on it, but then for the other panelists as well, but of course not excluding Mr. Groeneveld, what, to your opinion, would be the most suitable way for St. Martin to have representation in that branch? Let's say a kingdom parliament or whatever construction that we decide, whether it's going to be the parliaments together and we're going to have a committee, just to brainstorm to see how we can look forward to see how we can put some representatives, actual representatives, and not ministers with, blank votes in a decision-making capacity of the kingdom. And that's my question. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, MP Peterson. The question is on representation, and I'll then give the floor first to Professor Hochers.
First of all, it's wonderful to see a former student of mine now as a member of the Staten. So it's so yes, I'm honored to be able to, or at least to try to answer your question. One of the interesting things of the structure of the kingdom that was chosen in 1954 is that the representation, or let's say the participation of the Caribbean countries on decision-making on the kingdom level was organized through government and not through parliament. That's rather unique in the world. I mean, if you, for instance, look at Denmark, which is in a situation that is somewhat comparable to the Netherlands, they have 2 overseas territories, the Faroe Islands and Greenland. Those combined have a population of somewhere around 90,000, which is compared to the 5 million Danish in Denmark itself, roughly comparable to the 300,000 plus inhabitants of the Dutch Caribbean compared to the 17 million people living in the Netherlands proper. So they have chosen, starting already for the Faroe Islands in 1849 and then extending it to Greenland in 1953, to give them each 2 seats in the Danish parliament. So together these 2 overseas territories have 4 seats in the Danish parliament. There is nothing comparable to a Greenlandish minister plenipotentiary or anything in the Danish government. So it's a, and in France the structure is essentially the same. They chose to give their overseas territories and departments a say in parliament, roughly comparable to the size of their population compared to the size of metropolitan France. So, I mean, if we would choose to give St. Martin, Aruba, and Curacao representation in Parliament and then retain the ministers plenipotentiary, it would sort of be a double sweep, if you will, right? There is, interestingly enough, and you probably know that, but the government, the regeringsakkoord, the government accord of the new Dutch government, that took power last January, contains rather an interesting but sort of vague paragraph saying that they want to address the lack of representation through a form of proportional voting in the Dutch parliament. Nobody knows what that means yet, but it's there. Proportional voting. I mean, it suggests that there should be some form of representation. It's unclear whether that is going to be a permanent member or voting rights for representatives from the Staten in The Hague when an Act of the Realm is discussed, which is also possible, of course. proportional suggests that it should be along the lines of proportional representation, which makes sense because it's in the Dutch constitution. I quickly looked it up. It's not in Article 46 so much. It's not, the charter doesn't demand it, but it's in the constitution, so it's probably, you know, we would have to amend the constitution to change that, and that's not something that's going to happen very easily, I suppose. So you could think perhaps of and I agree with Mr. Romney. I mean, it would look nice, but it would, of course, not really mean anything if, let's say, for kingdom matters, the second chamber would be augmented by 3 members or so, representing, let's say, 1 Curacao, 1 Aruba, and 1 St. Martin. Then you would have 3 representatives that would have voting rights. Well, that would sort of correct the democratic deficit, but I would seriously doubt if that would enhance democratic legitimacy, because, you know, okay, then you have 3 people voting. Gee. Yeah, I mean, it's sometimes it might make a difference, you know. Sometimes 1 or 2 votes makes a difference, but a lot of times 1 or 2 votes do not make a difference. But there is another problem that we haven't discussed yet, and I think it matters. And it has to do with why on earth was a decision taken not to do that in 1954? Because it was on the table. And one of the reasons for that is that if that would have been done, you would have a limit on decision making from the overseas parliaments in discussions on acts of the realm. If that is going to be the case now, the same is probably going to happen. Because if you say, okay, we will now bring in 1 or 2 or 3, or let's assume maybe even 6, you know, 2 for each, or 3 for Curacao, and 2 for Aruba, and 1 for St. Martin, or something like that, to make it a bit more in accordance with the population differences between the 3 autonomous countries. Let's assume that. 6 seats for the overseas countries. So in Kingdom Affairs, the second chamber is now 156 instead of 150. If you do that, then these 6, and let's assume that those are going to be members of the Staten, right? Who are going to be sent to The Hague and then have voting rights. First of all, you would have to decide here who's going to have the voting right in The Hague. Who is that? Which member of the Staten is going to go to The Hague to bring the 1 St. Martin vote to the voting process? Second of all, if you do that, then basically the voice of St. Martin in an act of the realm procedure is going to be that 1 voice. It's one of the main reasons why in 1954 it was decided not to do that, because the alternative is that the Staten can decide to send as many people as they like to bring in, and one of the reasons that in the end all the 3 countries back then decided to do it like that is that you would enable the opposition in Parliament to bring its voice in The Hague in discussions on acts of the realm, because the Minister Plenipotentiary is probably going to voice the opinion of government, which is probably also the opinion of the majority of Parliament, given a parliamentary system. But if you say the overseas parliaments do not have voting rights, but they have the rights to participate, then all of a sudden it becomes possible to, if you wish, send the entire Staten. Because it doesn't matter. They don't vote, but they can bring their opinion. And one of the things that led to this decision not to give the overseas parliaments voting rights was this: to allow for the voice of the opposition to be heard in kingdom discussions. And of course, the Dutch political culture being what it is, the voice of the opposition matters. You know, we are a nette parlement. People get the right, yeah. So very often the opinions of the opposition are brought into the final decision making, because after the next election you have to govern with them again. So it's one of the things you have to take into if you want to correct this. If you say no, we do demand voting rights, one of the things that might happen is that you would lose this peculiar position you now have to participate to put it bluntly, because in the end, in the decision making, it doesn't matter how many members of the Staten there are. It allows for a plurality of voices to be heard from each of the three Staten during discussions on acts of a realm. I would argue that in the final analysis that might matter.
Thank you, Professor Hochers. I see Mr. Romney. Mr. Romney, and then Dr. Ardern.
Okay. I want to go back to MP Peterson. And yeah, within the whole concept of democratic deficit, it's all about numbers. And I will draw your attention to a paper here. He said, and two, we're looking at numbers. We're concerned with numbers, and we should be concerned with numbers. But the democratic deficit here, I say, it lies in the deficiency of legitimacy of the kingdom. Okay? And he spoke about, you're not being able to influence public policy. Okay? That doesn't come as a fact not of the numbers, it comes as a fact of our legitimacy. See, so it appears to be, there is the difference, but that difference is not about numbers, like you said, we could put numbers aside, okay? It's about our legitimacy, okay? And that is talking about with the whole constitutional framework, okay, how it functions for the centralization of power in the kingdom of government to unilaterally, okay, develop public policies that would have a profound impact locally without the input of St. Martin. See? So that it's all about legitimacy. I understand there's a number. And when you're talking about deficit, democracy deficit, you're talking about numbers. But yes, there is a deficit. The deficit comes up by the thing is that the Netherlands able to influence public policy without our consent. Okay, without our input.
Thank you, Ms.
Another thing we touch on, and you talked about the Miss Urine Wouters, mean that she could be elected. With Urine Wouters being part of the political party in the Netherlands, to my mind, that was a good political move. Because she was part of that political party, as from the Caribbean parts, so she can enhance, she can bring in that body of votes within the party, give the party a move forward. Splendid political move. However, if one looks at the St. Martin, or even the other islands within other countries, being part of a political, being elected to Parliament, so to speak, or Parliament of the Kingdom, or as it, we have indicated 12, 18, 20,000. That would make absolutely no difference. St. Martin or the Caribbean cannot system, and we having that St. Martin be able to vote in presenting in formal government. It's like come Saturday, Sunday, where St. Martin, the whole of St. Martin, French St. Martin in this case, can vote for the opposition. I forgot the young lady's name. That will make absolutely no difference in Macron being re-elected because of our numbers. Okay? So one thinking that if there was such that St. Martin can now vote for a parliament of the kingdom, it'll make a difference? No, it will not. It cannot because of our numbers. Our problem is not being identified, not being legitimate within the kingdom government. So what we have to do is find ways and means to decrease that lack of legitimacy.
Thank you, Mr. Romney. Dr. Ardoin, you have the floor.
As I indicated, I would constantly remind Parliament as advisor, because the whole reason for this discussion is advising Parliament. And I will also with this question, the most suitable way to have representation, and not to lose out of sight realities, right? That when we're looking at the form that we want to go into, we have to take things like capacity and understanding of what we are going into consideration. Take, for example, I believe it is Article 67 of the St. Martin Constitution, if I'm not wrong, 67 or 68, gives Parliament the authority to represent the interests of St. Martin and in the kingdom, right? How often have we done that? Does Parliament realize that? Article 17 of the Charter is giving Parliament the possibility of a special representative, bijzondere gedelegeerden, yes, to discuss. How often have we used that? So I admonish Parliament. This is really, you will see this through the whole day, and my opinion paper, bringing the discussion back in a relationship with reality, because we can make all kinds of nice forms and not looking at substance, and when we have the form, we don't use it as should. And with these two articles, Article 67 of the Constitution and Article 17 of the Charter, I'm showing, just tell me how often in these 12 years has Parliament made use of these articles? Yeah?
Thank you, Dr. Ardoin. Mr. Groenewald?
Thank you, Madam Chair. As Member of Parliament, Mr. Peterson indicated, I have documented my ideas about how we can change certain things, but I would like to repeat that it should not be about numbers, because as Mr. Romney have already indicated, and Professor Hochus also, we are outnumbered. But I would like to look for a minute at how a treaty, a verdrag, how a verdrag is adopted, how it is established. At the ministry in the Netherlands, it is drafted. It is sent to all the countries, to the government and to the parliament. And all the parliaments have to approve it and agree to it. And if they can't, then they say, no, I don't want this particular treaty to bind my country. And that happens. Or I don't want to be part of the treaty now, I will assent to it later on. So there are ways that we can be represented. And I repeat again, my belief is that the Kingdom Parliament should be the parliament of all the 4 countries. Because we are living in a modern time now where we have internet connection and WhatsApp and telephone, that the kingdom should make use of these possibilities to function as a closer unit. And maybe along these lines, if we do that, as I said, for Parliament, and we do that for the Rijksministerraad, because to me the major problem of the democratic deficit is when the Rijksministerraad, and Mr. Romney refers to it all the time, can take a decision that influence the country's autonomy, the autonomous rights that they have, and that is undemocratic. And that is what is mostly meant with the democratic deficit, and not so much that we lack the numbers. Yes, we lack the numbers. That's a fact we can change. But we can look for means and ways to get around that. And I could understand maybe when it comes to matters that are listed in Article 3 that are of the kingdom, that most probably we will be overruled, or we could be overruled, because it's the state of the Netherlands that finances those international aspects, and so we can't afford that, and that is a reality. But when it comes to internal matters pertaining to the autonomous sphere of the country, then the Rijksministerraad should not have the authority to influence those. And if the autonomy is not being protected in any one country, then a constitutional court or the Supreme Court would be the one that would have to correct that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Groeneveld. I look to the speakers list and I see MP Romu. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. A pleasant good morning to you and, of course, to my esteemed colleagues here, the listening. Yes, it's afternoon now, so I apologize for that. And, of course, to the viewing and listening public, and definitely to our esteemed panelists here this afternoon. I am really enjoying this very lively discussion we are having here today based on the various position papers and, of course, the various opinions of our panelists and our parliamentarians on the various topics at hand. And I must say that these discussions primarily ensue due to the topic of the decolonization process. So my question to all the panelists is based on the statement in the position paper of Mr. Groeneveld, which talks about the process of the constitutional change and the development of self-government, which was enacted in 1954 and thereafter. And it says, hence, we cannot still be considered a colony. And then the conclusion that it is legally not correct to state that we are still a colony of the Netherlands and that the decolonization process has not been completed. And this, of course, is based on the historical and constitutional perspectives that, according to Mr. Groeneveld, are not valid to argument, are no valid arguments to substantiate such a view. So my question is to the various panelists. Do you agree with this statement? And for the viewing and listening public, if Mr. Groeneveld can also elaborate on your statement based on the facts presented. Thank you, Madam Chair Lady.
Thank you, MP Romu. Mr. Groeneveld, you first have the floor, and then I can give the floor to the other panelists.
Yes, Madam Chair. I was hoping that you would allow the other panelists to react first. But if you want me to react, I can. I will do that short. I think the gist of what I wrote there is that we have been decolonized. The process has been completed. But if you ask, and I refer to that, I alluded to that just now, do we have a full measure of self-internal government? And then my answer would be yes and no. Yes on paper, but in reality, no. And that is what we have to address. And my view and my vision of addressing that is by making certain adaptations in the Kingdom Charter. I refer a while ago to the Regeringsreglement from 1865. And from there, you can see that the process of decolonization for us started. It continued in 1936-37 with the introduction of the first Curaçao staatsregeling, and then in 48 changes were made. In the regeringsreglement, there's an article that says the gouverneur regeert. That's no longer the case. Now, the people elect a parliament, and the parliament appoints a government, and that's the regering. And going back to the Montevideo Treaty, we meet all the requirements of becoming a state, an independent state. But as I said before, we have chosen not to use that option. But we still have that rights that if we decide we want to step out of the kingdom and become independent, we can do that. So taking all of that into consideration, I do not agree with people when they say we are still a colony. We are not a colony, but there are some structures in our charter that need to be changed to take away that perception that we are a colony. We can be overruled by the Rijksministerraad in our autonomous competencies, and that would create the impression that because of that, we are still colonized. If you are independent, it would definitely mean that no other level of government above you can take a decision to overrule your decision. If you apply that to your autonomous area of government, the same should apply, that no other level of government should be able to overrule any decision that you make in your autonomous authority. A court, a constitutional court or Supreme Court would be the one to determine that decision or that law that you made is unconstitutional. And that is where the judicial review ties in on a local level, but also on a kingdom level. And if we can work towards those changes, I think we will have a much better functioning kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Groeneveld. Dr. Ardern, you have the floor.
Again, the discussion, very important, very interesting. However, again, I'm coming from a very practical position. The question was whether we are still decolonized, and as you saw in my paper, I spoke about de facto decolonization, because I believe whatever the rhetoric around decolonization is, we have to look at de facto decolonization. What does it really mean? How broad do we want to interpret it? As I earlier indicated, the right of self-determination can be used in different ways. And my colleague referred, for example, to the government regulation of 1865, and is stating that the decolonization started then. Again, in the broader perspective, you then ask, okay, how do you interpret decolonization? If slavery was abolished in 1863, and in 1865 you have that and government regulations where the colonists really wanted more authority from the motherland. And we have to remember that, and it's something that have been confusing us in the Caribbean very much, the motherland. Who was the motherland? The motherland is the land, the land of origin of colonists. If we look at the literature and the law, before 1922, the laws refer to volksplantingen and bezittingen. Volksplantingen were the colonies, the people that left the Netherlands to come to the Caribbean. They were the colony. It's only in 1922 the territory became part of the kingdom. That the territories, Suriname, Curacao, and its dependency, Indonesia became, together with the European territory, the kingdom. So again, I bring into this discussion about are we still decolonized, it is all how broad and how deep you want to look at it, and that's why I just use the term de facto decolonization, because I even put a question mark for consideration of Parliament. Okay, de facto, would we be ever, how far ahead would we be able to talk about total decolonization if we bring into the equation economic factors? Yes, because of course economic factors have, during the whole decolonization process in the Caribbean, played a role. And so we should not overlook those realities in forming our opinion of where do we want to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ardern. Mr. Romney, and then.
The question whether or not we are decolonized, that should not be a question of doubt. Without question, we are decolonized. Okay? The whole international law goes back from United Nations. There are three areas or three requirements to be decolonized. One would be to the emergence of a sovereign independent state. Two, free association with an independent state. And the third, integration in an independent state. St. Martin, as part of the Netherlands Antilles, and then again reconfirmed 10-10-10, have decided what they want to be in free association. There's no question about it. We are decolonized, period. The process has been completed. In order to be an independent state, what does that mean? Okay? It means you have a permanent population, a defined territory, a government, a national identified government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states. Okay? I had what I consider to be a fortunate position some weeks ago to present this before a panel, or rather arbitration board in Switzerland, to show that we are that independent state. What we are not is a sovereign independent state. Okay? Words matters. We must put stuff in perspective. One or so, and my good friend Kroeneveld, he said it clearly. He said, well, we should be concerned, well, his answer was, are we independent, are we decolonized, yes or no? And I could understand that. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem before us here is not whether we are decolonized. We are under the yoke of imperialism. That is our problem. I mean, for instance, you find hold of the continent of Africa, probably the richest continent in the world, yet it's marginalized because what? They don't dictate public policy. We cannot dictate public policy because, granted, our size, what we produce. So therefore, we are under the yoke of imperialism, and we cannot. We have to separate those things. So we are decolonized, very well so. But for obvious reasons, we are under the yoke of imperialism. And yeah, it is what it is. And I can't help but, again, go back to a good colleague here and using the word de facto colonize. And a while I sat back and I ponder on that. What does that mean? De facto decolonize. In essence, what they're saying is you're holding a special position, but the fact is is not necessarily right legally. So you're saying you're decolonized, but legally you're not. That's what de facto means. And I must say again, St. Martin is proper decolonized. It is legal. So I cannot see using the term the de facto decolonized. Because legally we are. It's not something that we think we are. We are. Our problem here is we under the yoke of imperialism. So if we want to move forward, then we must find ways and means to lessen that imperialism. And that's not going to be an easy task. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Romney. I'd like to give the floor to Professor Hochers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in a bit of a pickle here, of course, because I'm the colonizer in the room. You know, it can't be helped. Therefore, I think it's very wise that you let the other three panelists voice their opinions first. But I feared that the dreaded Article 73 would come up. I feared it. No. I feared it. I prayed a little that might not happen, but it did, of course. Of course it did. So thank you for bringing up Article 73. I'm never entirely sure what exactly happened in 1955 in New York. And therefore I'm far less sure than my esteemed colleague to the right that decolonization actually happened, at least from a legal point of view. We can be sure of a few things. The United Nations decided, the General Assembly decided that the Kingdom of the Netherlands would no longer need to report. Article 73 quite strongly suggests that if you no longer have to report, then that means that the territory that you no longer have to report on is decolonized. But Article 73 also says that there has to be a statement about that. It has to be acknowledged by the General Assembly that that in fact took place, which did not happen. In fact, the Kingdom of the Netherlands is in the unique position, as far as I know, that it's the only former colonizing power of which the General Assembly did that. Something that Article 73 quite strongly suggests cannot happen. Article 73 quite strongly suggests that these two should be together, that there should be a decision on decolonization, and then, logically following from that, the decision that a country needs no longer to report. The Kingdom of the Netherlands, as far as I know, is the only country that are in the privileged position where the United Nations were so confused about what the Charter of the Kingdom was actually about that the General Assembly decided to put these two things apart, to say that we no longer had to report, but not formally declare that the territories of Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles were decolonized. So where does that leave us? Well, you can take two roads from a strictly legal point of view. And again, well, some of you are, like me, lawyers, and the reason people hate us is that when they ask us a concrete question, we tend to answer, it all depends on your point of view. That's what I'm going to do here as well. You can argue, and some colleagues of mine in the Netherlands argue that. They say that, look, because these two are in Article 73 interrelated, it is not possible to formally say that the Netherlands, Antilles, and Suriname were formally decolonized in 1951. That's, for instance, the decision that my former Leiden colleague, Steven Hillebrink, took in his dissertation on the right of self-determination of the Netherlands Antilles. You can also argue that since Article 73 logically locks these two together, that having formally declared that you no longer have to report, that must mean, although it is not formally said so, that the territories of Suriname and the Netherlands Antilles are decolonized. Which of these two is true? I don't know. I'm just a simple legal scholar. Now, as I often said, there is a beautiful Dutch proverb that says, met het pistool op de borst, right? When you put a gun to your breast. Now, if people would put a gun to my breast and say, okay, Hogers, what's your point of view? Choose. Then I, with the gun pointed at me, I would probably say that I tend to believe that the United Nations probably think that the Netherlands Antilles were decolonized. But I'm not sure. And it's sort of a, you know, that's also a very beautiful Dutch saying, een onderbuikgevoel. Do I have to translate that? Sort of a feeling deep down in the belly. It's not much more than that. It's not really founded in a lot of arguments. It's just that I tend to... A gut feeling. Yeah, so a gut, thank you, a gut feeling. Yes, that's the same, yes, a gut feeling. There is this, it's not much more than a gut feeling that Article 73, because it was not meant to be this, it was not meant to be used the way it was used by the General Assembly when it came to the decolonization of the Netherlands Antilles and Suriname, that probably you would have to say that they meant to say that, yes, decolonization took place. So that's one. Does it matter a lot? I'm not so sure. Take, for instance, France. I mean, France is dealing with the fact that the General Assembly has retreated for French Polynesia and for New Caledonia. These two territories used to be decolonized, they no longer are, officially. So that means that France has to report on them. Does France do that? No. No. Because France says, with typical French, well, what I would hesitantly describe as arrogance, and France itself would obviously not describe as arrogance, but France being France says, well, the General Assembly can say what it wants. We consider New Caledonia and French Polynesia to be decolonized. Within the French political framework, it doesn't seem to matter a lot. They are treated the same way as other French overseas territories. France does not report. The United Nations basically does nothing about that, except from saying every year that France should report. So, you know, I would hesitate. The official point of view of the Dutch government since a few years is that the international legal right of self-determination has worked out in 1954, that there is an internal right of self-determination based upon written kingdom law, but that according to international law, the Netherlands Antilles and Suriname have decolonized in 1954. So probably if the General Assembly would somehow decide that St. Martin is not properly decolonized in 1954, the Dutch standpoint point of view would be that it is. And I'm not sure whether that would lead to any practical differences in, so, I mean, what I'm trying to say basically is you can stare yourself blind upon this question, but I'm not sure that it really matters a lot what the General Assembly would say in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hogers. And we actually do have to break for lunch. On that final note, Miss Romney, you have 2 minutes.
I'll be brief. And I understand one having the opinion that we're not decolonized. I mean, decolonize from the requirements of the United Nations, which say they are the authority on determining who is and who is not. We have participated in that whole process and determined that what? we want to be form that free association. I mean, in all the literature, one goes to, and they voted on that. Say what, you are decolonized. We might not like the fact, or we might feel that we're not decolonized because of this, because of that, because of the structure. However, that does not take away the fact that we are decolonized. And I think if we're concerned with that, which all of us should be, then we find the appropriate way to make things better. And we, you know, if we want to go a step forward, we must again understand where we are. We are decolonized. We having some problems? Yes. And these problems, again, I will come back to the whole concept of democracy legitimization. When we, the whole process of forming or going to the process of decolonization, that was handled wrongly. And I could refer back to a paper I wrote some years ago on ethnicity, because then we, as the Netherlands, Antilles, or these countries, were not really identified within this process. Our culture, our language, what have you, was not put into this whole process in determining where we are. But without question, if we want to follow the law, it's legal, we are decolonized. We might not like the way it happened. We might have our differences, but that does not take away the fact. So we must go not based on opinion, but the fact, and which is United Resolution 94510. Clear.
Thank you, Mr. Romney. I believe that we have come to the end of at least this first half of today's meeting. The content, I believe, has definitely added value to the discourse here in Parliament, and I believe for the general public as well. So I would like to thank the panelists and the members of Parliament so far. We are breaking just for lunch. We will return at 1:45 p.m. I would like to remind the public to send in any questions that they may deem important to the link that we've provided on Facebook. And when we return at 1:45, we will continue with members of Parliament, but also we will field the questions from the general public to the panelists. So meeting adjourned until 1:45 p.m.